I'm going to talk the next 20 minutes about more like architecture and technology, right? And I kind of noticed that I'm kind of the odd one out, right? So can I get like a quick show of hands, like people who consider themselves in UX, right? People who consider themselves product or product managers. Any engineers in the room? Ah, okay. All right. Okay, I will try to keep it high level, right? And I try to kind of explain the more technical jargon in there. If there's anything unclear, please let me know. Right. So my name is Ronald van Rijn, or Ronald van Rijn for Dutch people. So I worked at lots of companies you probably know, and one company you probably don't know about yet. So my current company where I work at, Fuga, they offer a digital supply chain for music. And that's a very difficult way of saying we basically connect record labels with the digital streaming platforms. So a record label can upload basically all of their music into our content management system, and we will distribute it to all the digital streaming services out of there, like Spotify, Apple Music, Google Music, anything like that. And then once the tracks are being played, right, we basically bring back all of the trends information, all of the analytics, we group that in a meaningful way, and we bring it back to our customers. And we can like offer like a full service portfolio where we also take care of royalties, or they can take care of all of that stuff themselves. So about that title, right? You're not Netflix. It's kind of like a sentence I've been using more and more, but it's kind of like it could also have been Booking, right? You're not Booking, or any other company like Netflix and Booking.com and so many other companies like Spotify, for example. They're amazing companies, right? And I think everyone should look at what they're doing and draw inspiration from that, right? But what I see happening more and more is that people start copying what they're doing without understanding why they started doing that in the first place, right? And one area where I noticed this a lot is in architecture, and more specifically, microservices architecture. So companies start with new architecture, and the first thing they basically say is, we need microservices. Look at all of these companies, they're doing microservices. We also need microservices. These guys are fast, we want to be fast. So not so long ago, I got called by a technical director from a company I will not name. And they were struggling. So he asked me to kind of talk to his engineering team, because his engineering team was slow. They were not delivering what he wanted, right? They were making bugs and stupid mistakes, at least in his eyes, right? And he couldn't understand why. Like the whole thing didn't make sense to him. They were building something new. And a couple of months ago, his architect laid down this amazing architecture. He looked at the best companies in the world, right? And took the best part of that and laid down like a reference architecture for the team to follow. And it was based on microservices, the newest AWS technologies and stuff like that. And I started talking to the team, and I kind of like found like a team of 5 engineers, right? And they were talking about the application they were building. They were building like an application to kind of capture orders and send them to SAP for a user base of 5 people. And if they were successful, their user base would probably grow to 15 people, right? But yet they were building everything based on this enormous reference architecture, right? So like the application was like fully split up into microservices. They had like 25, 30 microservices. They had like a separate front end. And basically all of their time was basically spent managing their architecture, and they lost a lot of time because of that, and couldn't implement a lot of features. And this is one of those instances where I kind of need to go back to people and say, like, look, I know the best of the world are doing this, but you're not Netflix, right? So what the team was experiencing is something that's kind of coined as a microservices premium. So microservices are being used to manage like a very complicated infrastructure and very complicated problems, right? But it also brings like complications with it itself, right? Like when you introduce this architecture, you need to manage complex situations. So first situation you will run into, and they immediately ran into it, right, is eventual consistency. So basically when you start partitioning your software into multiple pieces, and you want to remain like highly available, right, which most systems want to be, you'll run into a situation where you lose consistency, right? You could write something from like one process to service A and service B, and this stuff goes across the wire, right, needs some time to processing. When process 2 basically starts reading it, anything could happen, right? So it could read something that was written by process 1, could read nothing that was written by process 1, or either of the values, right? Like what you get is unpredictable, and you need to cater for that, right? And there are many techniques to cater for that, but the only thing that's important is that it costs time, or sometimes, in case of Marktplaats, for example, a company where I worked for, eventual consistency was fine to basically show to our users. The other thing you need to take care of is intermittent failures, right? So once you start kind of splitting up your software, and software doesn't talk to each other directly in the JVM or whatever platform you use, right? And you start sending information over the network, you basically experience the same thing that will happen when you basically make phone calls on a network, or when you're trying to look at nu.nl on the network, right? Like sometimes stuff drops, sometimes stuff fails, right? And so in the microservices architecture, you need to take care of failures much more than direct process communication. And the other thing, right, is here's just like some extreme examples, right? Halo, Netflix, and Twitter, because we have some information on how big these guys are, and this is already from a long time ago, so probably bigger, right? If you have this many different software components, there's no way you can manage that by hand, right? There's no way you can deploy this or bring this to production by hand. There's no way you can monitor this by hand, right? Where in your founding stages, or when you're just with 5 developers, you might want to do, right? You might want to just kind of like manually deploy the first versions of your software, just to kind of prove value. It's impossible when you start working on this scale, right? So basically this kind of led to some of the kind of brighter minds in our industry to kind of say, like, don't even think about microservices if you have a system that's so simple you can manage as a monolith, right? So the monolith, for people who are unaware, is just packaging all of your software together, right, and deploying it as one package. And then basically, when I start talking about monoliths, usually the first response I get is like, yeah, but that's like architecture from the past, right? That's exactly what we wanted to get away from. We had the monolith in our past. It was horrible. It was the worst experience we ever had, right? So this new thing we're going to build for sure needs to be microservices. I don't think this always holds true. I think there are very valid cases for sometimes starting with like a monolithic application. Actually, 2 of the companies I worked for, Marktplaats and Fuga, basically proved success in this way, right? So Marktplaats, I think it's 20 years ago already, they built their application as a huge monolith, right? They still had to prove themselves, similar to Fuga, right? They kind of had to prove themselves in the market, and then a monolith will allow you to kind of quickly iterate, do a lot of stuff manually, while you kind of prove out your model. So there is also a whole bunch of group of people that basically oppose Martin Fowler, right? And basically say, like, don't start a monolith when your end goal is to get microservices, right? And I think there is some truth to that. So basically, when choosing your architecture, it basically always depends on different things. So I guess the most important thing here is that choosing your architecture is like choosing from a spectrum, right? And on one end of the spectrum, there is like the one monolith, and the other side is like the 500 microservices architecture that Netflix has, right? But there's a whole bunch of stuff in between, right? When we were at Marktplaats, when we started chipping away at our monolith, right? We went from monolith to 2 monoliths, right? 3 monoliths, we started cutting out stuff, right? And like over time, it became like microservices. So there are many things in between. So if the kind of like the answer is not that black and white, right? So, but I will try to give you some kind of like tools to decide where to start if you need to build like a new software project. So the first thing I guess is like the size of your engineering team. So if it's just Kevin, Bob, and what's the third guy's name? If you only have like 3 rockstar engineers, right? Consider definitely starting with like a monolith, right? Like 3 people can easily work together on a single code base, deploy it, right? If you're the size of Booking.com, right? Definitely consider splitting up your software, right? It will allow the teams to iterate very fast on their own piece of software, deploy it to production. It's one thing to take into account. The second thing, I guess, is the kind of the stage of your product, right? Is it the flying car that you want to develop, right? Or Marktplaats 20 years ago? Consider starting with a monolith, right? Make it easy for yourself and focus on proving the value of your product instead of focusing on your architecture. Are you building something that has been proven like 10 times over, right? And you know you're going to need microservices to do it, right? So let's say you're building Disney Plus, kind of like the rival for Netflix. You're pretty sure you're going to need some kind of microservices architecture, right? Go for it right away. Another important thing is the kind of the domain knowledge of your team. You have like seasoned veterans, people who understand your domain through and through, right? Or do you have guys that are kind of showing up first day on the scene, trying to understand kind of like the domain they're in, right? The domain knowledge is so important because once you start splitting up software, right, you need to put boundaries around elements of your domain. And if you put the boundaries wrong, right, the architecture will start working against you.